thank you for having me here. I'm going to talk about a new project I'm working on. It's actually on the media history of the credit card. And it's bringing me, well, personally, I'm moving a bit away from the histories of networking to a more praxeological style and media history, or I'm trying to get at that point. So what you see is mostly pre-archival work. It will be quite synoptic, but you have all the chances of intervening into the methodological and theoretical ideas that I'm going to bring up. And I'm actually grateful that Jim Cortada had that on a slide, all of the things that we have to tackle. And Bernd said a lot about that in his talk. So there has been quite a lot of speculation on the reasons why consumer credit proved to be such a specialty development of the United States, leading up to a veritable credit card nation after a fragmented, highly local, wild and innovative growth of credit card usage from the 1950s on. Louis Mandel, the first eminent historian of the credit card, has made the case that after World War II, government programs such as workers' compensation, unemployment, and disability insurance paved the way for a rising consumerism. It was government spending that set the mood for credit. This Keynesian background, along with the rather stable Bretton Woods financial system, I knew this was going to happen. This is Sprechzeug for German telephony engineers. Anyway, so there was a Keynesian background along with the rather stable Bretton Woods financial system, and it led to a hitherto unknown spread of consumerism in the Western welfare states. The US first and foremost benefited from its wartime economy and innovation in these so-called 30 glorious years of capitalism lasting from 1945 to approximately 1975. The American middle class turned to credit once the wartime savings were spent. Consumers asked for more credit, and they got it by a flourishing financial and real estate industry that made credit purchasing the currency of the so-called Consumers' Republic. And financial and real estate adds up to FIRE as an acronym. Digging deeper into the history of mentalities and economic exchange usually brings up both rural and urban neighborhood practices of installment and revolving credit that date back at least to the year 1800. And scoring consumers' credit worthiness dates back at least to the year 1841, when the first agency for this is being founded in New York. As David Stearns has convincingly argued, there also is a both political and infrastructural momentum in handling the growing usage and clearance of checks that parallels this development. Handling and regulating the constant flow of paperwork even played a role in the establishment of the US Federal Reserve System in 1913. The American geographies of exchange with their long distances called for technologies of mediated trust, especially once the mobility of a whole society grows like it did in the 19th and 20th century. Suburban shopping centers and credit cards form two sides of a new coin. So how can we step along those lengthening chains of mediation that create the dynamic and fluctuating topologies of social interaction, intéressement, and enrollment of the actors and payment practices? And what makes the prestigious Diners Club or American Express card such an effective and attractive medium? One that is mobile, bureaucratic, and cooperative at once. Along with Harold Garfinkel and Michel Calon, some preliminary answers might be given. The production of accountability is a multifold process, or as Garfinkel would put it himself, a contingent ongoing accomplishment in common situations. Making things and yourself accountable includes the activities, and I quote, whereby members produce and manage settings of organized affairs which are identical with members' procedures for making those settings accountable. This includes a reflexivity of intertwined actions that rely on a high degree of social indexicality. Everyday reflexivity is based on explicit gestures and speech acts of showing and telling the others, and tacit intercorporeal ways of bodily interrelation. Garfinkel also uses his artful way of listing practices to explain the modalities of accountability. And I quote, "In exactly the ways in which a setting is organized, it consists of methods whereby its members are provided with accounts of the setting as countable, storyable, proverbial, comparable, picturable, representable, id-est, accountable events." What seems like a sociological pun does already include the formalities of institutional settings and machinal automatizations, e.g. of bank accounting. All bureaucratic media, especially files and forms, in the case of money and credit, exist to produce a rather rigid infrastructural form of accountability by setting the standards for what is detectable, countable, comparable, and representable. They mediate social relations as well as they are producing them. Making oneself accountable in such a mixed realities combines the rigid bureaucratic media and the performativity of interaction between people, objects, signs, and institutions, including all possible forms of conflict, of course. Interestingly, the credit card mobilizes the usual bureaucratic and economic procedures to an unknown extent when it comes into being. A highly localized American bank account now extends way beyond the rural and urban neighborhood because it can be used at every place that accepts the new way of payment. And the whole American banking industry is changing through that. I think you've been calling it the desegregation of the American banking business. This makes the credit card a cooperative social medium that is changing the geographies of shopping, the way you move. It creates what ethnomethodologists like Lucy Giessmann call a technology of accountability, which is producing new portable neighborhoods that are able to lengthen chains of operations substantially. This spatial dynamic might not be new to capitalist modes of exchange, as one can learn from the seminal works of Fernand Braudel. In fact, paper-based transactions extended the geography of mercantile circulation and action at a distance, at least from the Middle Ages onward. Just remember Marshall McLuhan's famous dictum on money, the poor man's credit card, in Understanding Media. Shortly before the event of paper money, the greatly increased volume of information movement in European newsletters and newspapers created the image and concept of national credit. Such a corporate image of credit depended then as now on the fast and comprehensive information movement that we have taken for granted for 2 centuries and more. At that stage of the emergence of public credit, money assumed the further role of translating not just local but national stores of work from one culture to another. On a smaller level, that one which I'm interested in, this translation is getting repeated with the interconnection of personal bank accounts, mass consumer credit, networked systems of trust, and digital computing that is novel to American post-war culture. By now, it does not come as a surprise that American Express gained a significant advantage when it started using computers for its billing and bookkeeping in the early 1960s and surpassed Diners Club, which had brought the credit card into being in 1950. So by then, it was a step that few banks and other businesses were taking in such a consequent manner, although many of them tried to do so. So while the impact of IT on credit card banking cannot be underestimated, it should also not be overestimated. The social dynamics of the credit business and of the banking business are mostly external to computerization, yet they were pushing the technological developments of cooperative digital computing resources. As historian of technology Thomas Haig has shown, there was a wide gap between the American computing hypes and the actual adoption of new digital accounting practices. This has to be kept in mind because the laboratory situation of digital networking, or netting, as J.C.R. Licklider has called it, has brought up so many different localized approaches in the US between 1950 and 1975 that the successful endeavors enjoy a prestigious historical status. Just consider SAGE for the military purpose of missile defense, American Airlines and IBM's Sabre for airline ticketing, or the now seemingly magic ARPANET for academic resource sharing. Out of the early special purpose digital networks, the economic usages likely had the biggest impact for everyday use before the World Wide Web. Mass consumer credit seemingly pushed forward the need for digital accounting and trusted transactions. But was this due to mere necessity in data processing, Or is there a more specific relation between the history of credit, technologies of accountability, and the theory of digitally networked social media? I'll come back to that in the end if we got the time. In the mid-1960s, there is a peculiar change to be noticed concerning the social realities of credit card usage. Diners Club, American Express, and a lot of other go-it-alone firms supplied a service that appealed to the white traveling salesman and the upper class, with accounts that primarily referred to this person alone. Throughout the 1960s and 1970s, this social background was being transformed, making credit cards a payment technology that could be used pretty much by the whole middle class. Gender gaps were still highly present, most visibly in advertising, yet credit by card soon extended its reach into whole families and company usage of corporate accounts. Actual discrimination of women persisted on a wide scale, though mortgage lenders and credit card vendors like Carte Blanche and American Express required men to be the legal holder of credit accounts. But gender roles were also changing quite drastically in a short time, and the overall gendering of the consumer shifted from women to couples and at times to men alone. Changes in the social stratification of credit did not come out of the blue, but responded to the dynamic, unsolicited mass mailings of new cards that were being addressed to pretty much everyone, including children and dogs. And that's not a legend, it's true. This wild and highly dynamic phase quietly brought up issues of legal regulations, and it created a significant demand, not just for market research, but also for empirical studies of credit card use. Within this context, some details of marketing credit cards to the masses were analyzed swiftly by social research. The young Louis Mandel prepared an extensive field survey for University of Michigan's Institute for Social Research in Ann Arbor, interviewing about 4,000 heads of households in 2 waves in January, February, April, and May of 1970. Its carefully prepared forms and computed statistics already show some of the social biases and the stratification that was influential both for marketing and usage. And Mandel is pretty straightforward. Actually, his most significant finding is that credit cards were marketed to young families from the beginning on. At least that beginning in the middle of the would be in the middle of the 1960s. Within the credit card rush, critics noted that only 1/5 of the banks did actually really check the economic background of the addressees. Hence, the anecdotes on dogs and children do not seem as unlikely as they sound, and the lax and over-hasty mailing campaigns have been confirmed by oral history interviews, and they were also part of contemporary cartoons. And I show you one, and come back to that in a minute. These actions were meant to make the case for signing up more merchants so that both sides could be enrolled in what is now being called the two-sided platform market. This marketing device can be traced right back to the beginning of what would later become Bank Americard, which turned into the Visa Association in 1976. Bank of America ran its first market tests as early as 1958 in Fresno, California. Side effects of this strategy, namely credit card theft, fraud, and significant losses, had been known to the card businesses even before the Second World War. Nonetheless, the 1960s rise of the big so-called cooperative networks of Bank America, that's the future Visa, and MasterCharge, that's the future MasterCard, involved a race to the bottom. Who could get out more cards to more people in a shorter amount of time? Network excellence like fraud were being taken for granted by the banking industry, which multiplied its marketing efforts. So speeded up mailings were one massive effort to differentiate the nearly identical services in payment and credit. On the other hand, branding and advertising attempted to establish the credit card signs in the public, therefore promoting new forms of making oneself socially and economically accountable by using new ways of payment. A whole media ecology of newspapers, billboards, sports stadiums, radio, and TV ads was getting mobilized to install signs of trust in almost every wallet on almost every merchant's door, lengthening the new chains of transaction into every neighborhood and every shopping center relied heavily on mass media coverage. Picture this as an intermediate frenzy that is quite literally targeting the suburban middle class, by mailing ever more unsolicited cards, by repeating the taglines all over again, and we all know them, by showcasing scenes of easy payment. It was a broadcasting situation with a lot of messages that were being delivered with plastic cards attached. A highly popular Life magazine article by Paul O'Neill, published in the March 27 issue of 1970, sums up the social troubles. So it still pictures the traveling salesman up in the air, in a way, mobilized by credit card wings. The cover served as a reminder of the elite travel and entertainment cards, not yet reflecting the reality that the suburban, well-educated WASP families with kids were the main users of credit cards. O'Neill's article rather satirically retold the stories of banking competition and its discontents. But it's a well-researched article, so what you're about to hear is pretty close to what was happening in Chicago. During 1966, banks fought each other like jackals to get their cards into the hands of the public, only to discover that brigades of thieves, conmen, and deadbeats were galloping through stores with them and running up disastrous sums in fraudulent and uncollectible debt. Credit cards, and particularly bank cards, have inspired new and enduring types of white-collar crime, have attracted the beady attention of the mafia, and have revealed a fascinating capacity of dishonesty in employees of the postal system, who steal them from the mails and sell them up for prices, up to $50. Apart from these network accidents, which did not come as a surprise to the banks themselves, the American public already regarded computing, accounting, and credit data as a key technology. It was deemed necessary in handling the substantial paperwork involved in transactions. Both Bank Americard and MasterCharge already had set up regional computing centers that, given the amount of credit card fraud, were especially important for validating transactions above $50. This would typically require the merchant to call a center, reading out the customer's card number, which the telephone girl would enter into the computer terminal to cross-check on the customer's account. And this is pretty much standard procedure around 1970. This kind of everyday proof of a person's economic accountability is what occurs to O'Neill as a likely future of the medium's automation. And I quote, "The bank card is an imperfect medium of exchange at the moment because nobody can be absolutely certain that it, unlike the impersonal $20 bill, is always backed by real buying power." So extending chains of financial operation to an electronic domain creates a tremendous necessity for remediated trust and new identification practices. Certification, validation, standardization, legal security, and costly public relations are needed to establish the new technologies of credit with mobile users and shifting topologies of cooperation. Interestingly enough, the caption of a cartoon created by illustrator John Hoonagers sums up the situation quite accurately. In a rush to get their plastic in the air, banks randomly fired off credit cards. Computers, key to controlling them, are still trying to catch up. And in many ways, they have done so, but I wanted to just give you an idea of what this wild and creative phase looked like. And then it actually was driven by the user interactions. You still got, well, all of the managerial discussions. You got the standardization issues coming up pretty quickly, actually. But those respond, well, to a multitude of practices that were not really computable in a way. Although it was, we are speaking about very traditional practices of accounting in the end. So, how could we understand these formative years on a more theoretical level? And I'm going to close with that. I got loads more of material, the credit card in 2001. It's just a brief sequence, but I'll end up with some theoretical remarks. Along with Harold Garfinkel, it can be said that a new medium of sociality is getting invented that relies on the credit card as a medium of accountability and shifting mobile interactions. Being part of the paper-based and electronic bureaucratic process includes a person's, a family's, or a corporation's investment in forms, as Laurent Thévenot has formulated this kind of social media interaction so aptly. Along with Michel Calon, we might understand the configuration of new chains of payment operations as one way to make a heterogeneous techno-economical network A, convergent, and B, irreversible in its translations. As Calon has shown, this is a significant element of networking practices, and, as I would like to add, of the infrastructural platforms they rely on. Convergence is what actors strive for to make heterogeneous cooperation work more smoothly. Irreversibility is what actors need to normalize operations, like paying, defining standards, certification practices, and common modes of exchange. This is less a static way of blackboxing, to which it can lead nonetheless. It is rather a way to deal with fluctuating and dynamic network properties that the actors themselves create while charging, paying, borrowing, trusting, and distrusting, of course. These, however, practices that are almost then as now being regulated by digital platforms that have a highly administrative or self-administrative character. So making yourself accountable is part of ecologies of practices that rely on social media platforms. Credit cards and their economies and markets might let us know a bit more about our contemporary media culture and its bureaucratic and administrative foundations in digital media. We just have to ask. Thanks a lot for your attention.